At this moment, Beijing is still yet to call Putin's war as invasion. U.S. officials are concerned that China may provide economic or military aid to Russia. Could you tell us what is China's position and calculations for this crisis in Ukraine, and what is your interpretation of China's ambivalence?
Well, I think China and Russia have grown closer in the past several years, and I think at this stage you can call their relationship an entente, to use the French diplomatic term. It's not a full-scale alliance, but they've got mutual understandings to reinforce each other's positions. So for Russia in Europe and the Middle East, and for China in the Indo-Pacific and also in the Middle East. I think China is providing assistance to Russia in a number of different ways. Many of them will be covert, but I think it's trying to help Russian financial institutions navigate the sanctions that have been imposed on them. I think China is prepared to buy more Russian gas and oil to counter the effects of the embargo on that. And I think it's prepared to provide military assistance or to divert military capabilities to aid the Russian effort. So China's public position will be that they want a peaceful solution and that nobody should do anything to make the situation worse. But I think, in fact, there's very close consultations between the two countries, and that China, in ways that are not terribly visible, is definitely behind Russia.
When Putin has become the pariah of international communities, why Xi Jinping is still hesitant to stay away from Putin?
Well, I think this is something that China is watching very carefully. So obviously the reputational damage that Russia is suffering is not something that China wants to see happen to itself, or certainly Xi Jinping doesn't want to be seen in the same way that Vladimir Putin is being seen. So I think China will try to learn from the mistakes that Russia has made, but it's also looking for mistakes that the United States and the Western alliance have made, all of which is to help China better calculate what it will do if it moves against Taiwan, if it moves in the South China Sea, if it moves against Vietnam or India on the mainland. So this is a learning experience for China in many respects.
What are the common grounds that Xi Jinping and Putin have, and what are the potential conflicts of the two countries?
Well, I think the Entente could develop into an alliance. And what they share is a desire to be free of the institutions and norms of in commercial and political terms of the developed world. Certainly, China has made that clear in the World Trade Organization. When they were admitted 20 years ago, people in the United States and Europe thought that the dealing with the rest of the world in regular commercial channels would change how China behaved, and that has proven not to be true. China, if anything, now is exported its mercantilist economic policy into the World Trade Organization. They both want to be free of the constraints of dealing with U.S. dollars, which is the world currency. Neither China nor Russia has a convertible currency now, and that puts them at a real disadvantage, and they hope that by working together they can form an economic bloc that can operate independently of the dollar. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think that's their aspiration. And they have many things in common that move them closer together. China is an energy-poor country, whereas Russia has enormous reserves of oil and natural gas. So China's a natural purchaser, Russia's a natural seller. Russia has sold China sophisticated military weapon systems for many years, and that will likely continue. Their shared geographic space in Asia, it makes that a very powerful geographic bloc. And I think that the pressures from the outside world that Russia is experiencing now will push them together as well. So they have a lot in common. There are differences too. I think it should be U.S. policy to try and split that bloc. That was a successful policy at the end of the Cold War. And the partnership now is very different because China is the senior partner and Russia is the junior partner, which was very different from the Cold War where the reverse was true.
How could these two countries be equal partners when Russia's GDP is less than 10% of China's? Would Putin be satisfied to be like a kid brother of Xi Jinping?
Well, I think this is going to be a lot more difficult relationship in that sense than either China or Russia understand at the moment. I think the performance of Russia's military in Ukraine has been so unexpectedly poor that will hurt Russia's position. But it is still one of the two leading nuclear powers in the world, and its nuclear capabilities are something that the rest of the world has to take into account. But I think simply the size of the economy over time will be a dispositive factor. And I think it's going to be very uncomfortable for the Russians. But as of yet, they don't see it that way. I talked to Russians when I was National Security Advisor and said, I don't think this direction is going to be satisfactory for Russia over the long term, and I did not persuade them of that. But that will be something that by the time they get committed further to this relationship, it may be impossible to back away.
It has been 3 weeks since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it is hardly a blitzkrieg for Russia. Do you think Russia is still a world power seeing that? And what kind of main problems of Russia have got exposed in this war?
Well, Russia's made many mistakes. I think probably the biggest mistake was an intelligence failure. They believed this would be a lot easier than it's turned out to be. And I think, most of the Western intelligence assessments also thought that Russia would prevail more quickly. But the Ukrainians have fought very heroically. They have taken advantage of Russian weaknesses, mistakes in strategy, mistakes in tactics, logistical failures, the Russians unable to provide food or gasoline to their soldiers just a few miles across the Russian border. And so all of this has done enormous reputational damage to the Russian military. And I think that's something that China is watching, but I think all of Russia's European neighbors are watching this too. So I believe the conclusion is that Putin and his advisors will feel that they have to do something, have some kind of military success to repair the damage that's been done to their military's reputation. Because leaving Ukraine aside entirely, if Russia's military loses its credibility, that means they have only their nuclear weapons really to rely upon. And that's a very significant shift. So unfortunately, I think that means that to find this way to repair the damage that's been done, Putin has to find some kind of military victory. And I don't know how he will define that, and I don't know when it will come. But I think what that means is that the war will go on so that Russia will still be perceived worldwide as a great power.
We have seen some Ukrainian people comparing Putin with Hitler. Do you see the similarities between the two people? And how have you seen Putin's evolvement in the past 23 years since he got into power?
Well, I think Putin is clearly an authoritarian figure. I don't think he has an ideology of like Hitler does, and he, as bad as his acts are, they don't come close to the Holocaust that Hitler conducted against the Jews. But the authoritarian nature of Russian society, it's not communist in ideology anymore, but it is authoritarian, is similar to other authoritarian regimes. I first met Putin in October of 2001 when I was at the State Department. I accompanied Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld to Moscow right after the 9/11 attacks. And I've met with Putin many times since then. He's very cold-blooded. He's one of the hard men of history, and he has a very clear idea of what he thinks Russia's national interests are. In 2005, he spoke to the Russian Duma, the parliament, and he said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And that was a mark of reflecting his concern as he had watched the Soviet Union break up after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and should have been a signal to us that he intended to change that and to repair the damage that Russia had suffered. And I think that's really what's motivating him now. I don't think this is irrational. I don't think he's lost track of the real world. I think he values regaining Ukraine, Belarus, and other parts of the former Soviet Union, and this is what he's trying to do.
And besides Putin, another authoritarian strongman in today's world is Xi Jinping. Do you see similarities between Putin and Xi Jinping?
Well, I think they are clearly authoritarian rulers. I think Putin is much more of a post-communist authoritarian. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Boris Yeltsin abolished the Communist Party. He didn't abolish all the parts of the former Soviet Union. The KGB survived, and many think that, in effect, what's ruling Russia now is what the Russians call the siloviki, the men of power, from the military, from the intelligence services. But it's not a communist party, it's not a communist ideology, it's just authoritarian. Whereas in China, the Communist Party is still the dominant force. Now, it's not so ideologically Marxist as it was before, but it's still a cohesive political organization, and that's where the real power is held. Putin doesn't have anything like that kind of structure, and Xi Jinping's power stems from his ability to control the party and through it the People's Liberation Army, whereas Putin simply controls the military, the intelligence, the power agencies. And in that sense, they operate in different ways, but they have both now established themselves as rulers for life, in effect, in their respective countries. And I think that that enables them to have a closer relationship because they both understand how the other one functions. I think that China and Russia in recent years have both been very successful in their overt efforts to influence public opinion in their domestic situations, but internationally as well. Some of that has been covert, some of it has been overt. During my time as National Security Advisor, the director of the CIA said to me that she thought that China's clandestine operations of influence operation were much greater than Russia's, and I think the evidence bears that out. I think we're only coming to that understanding late, but I think it's very important for the United States to have the capability to respond to disinformation from its adversaries, but also to explain what America's position is and to tell the truth. And that's something that if I'd stayed in the government, I wish I would have been able to do a lot more on, but it's extremely important. During the Cold War, we saw how important it was to tell the truth to the people behind the Iron Curtain. And that remains important today. And while our efforts are extensive and much more could be done, and I hope Congress understands that.
China is going to hold the 20th Party Congress later this year. Is there any doubt that you think Xi Jinping is going to get a third term?
I think this is part of the Chinese Communist leadership sizing up the Biden administration to try and determine how they would react if China put pressure on Taiwan, for example. Certainly in the first year of the Biden administration, despite some tough campaign rhetoric, there's been very little to deal with things China's been doing in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, domestically repressing the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, eliminating the one country, two systems regime in Hong Kong, a whole series of things like that. So it's, I think, the assessment that Xi is trying to make is whether Biden would stand up if China exerted pressure in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure he's got that in mind as he faces the next party Congress. But unless I miss my guess, most of his enemies have been removed from senior positions in the Communist Party. I think there are many other challenges because I don't think China is nearly as stable domestically as some people would like the rest of the world to believe. I think the problems are growing, an aging population, economic instability, parts of the country that are still unhappy being ruled from Beijing. The Taiwan problem remains. And in any authoritarian regime, there are nonetheless struggles for control. So, but in the near term, I think Xi is very much in control, and I think that'll be reaffirmed.
Will China become a more dangerous opponent for the U.S. when Xi Jinping continues to be China's leader after 10 years in power? What's the grand strategy the U.S. should have to deal with China, especially with the war in Ukraine as a reference?
Well, I think China does have a grand strategy. I think you see many aspects of it, and it covers the full range of activity from economic matters to political to military. And I think its near-term objectives are clearly to establish hegemony in the Indo-Pacific, to become a global power, and ultimately to overtake the United States as the most powerful country in the world. So the immediate objectives for the United States are to try to deal with issues that have gone largely unnoticed for many years. The theft of intellectual property by the Chinese state-owned enterprises, that's been an enormous contribution to China's ability to undercut its competitors in international economics. The manipulation of the World Trade Organization, the unfair competition that China exerts through subsidies and preferential financing for Chinese state-owned enterprises, and a whole range of economic policies that are not consistent with the free market, and in particular using Chinese companies as agents of the state for politico-military purposes, like Huawei and ZTE, which are not simply telecommunications companies. They're intended to get control of international telecommunications, not simply for economic benefit, but for the benefit of intelligence gathering and influence operations. China has dramatically scaled up its military expenditures. Over the years, it's increasing its ballistic missile capability. It's got some of the best cyber warfare operations in the world. It really, across the whole spectrum of military power, China has been building up, and the United States and the West as a whole have not been paying attention. So these are all issues that I think the war in Ukraine now highlights, as people recognize that that although there's a war in Europe, which has woken up the Europeans, that it's all not sweetness and light around the world, the real focus for the rest of the 21st century will be in the Indo-Pacific. So to the extent that the U.S. can alert Europe to what Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, India, Australia, Southeast Asia already know, I think that will help get a more unified response to China. But that also goes back to reinforcing the Russian-Chinese entente, because as Russia is isolated from Europe now, isolated from the West, it doesn't have much of an option other than to turn to China.
Some people in Taiwan, they have raised concerns about Taiwan might be the next Ukraine under China's decades-long ambition. Do you see the imminent danger of China's invasion into Taiwan?
I don't see it as, I don't see China imminently invading Taiwan. In fact, I think in their preference in Beijing, they don't want to have to fight to get Taiwan. They don't want to inherit an island that's full of destruction. They don't want to see Taiwan's productive capabilities, chip manufacturing facilities or industry or the Kaohsiung port or really any of the enormous amount of economic productivity on Taiwan impaired. They want the island the way it is now. They just want it under Beijing's control. So the preferred way to accomplish that is not to invade, but to confront Taiwan with circumstances that make it impossible for the United States to aid Taiwan, to find an American leader who won't defend Taiwan, who won't respond to Chinese threats, and that leave the government in Taiwan with no option. Now, China has tried this before in the late 1990s. Even the Bill Clinton administration responded very strongly by sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups toward the Taiwan Strait, and China backed down. I don't think Xi Jinping wants to do this at great risk, because if he tried to confront Taiwan and the United States in a way that the United States did not back down, that could be threatening to Xi Jinping's regime. So he wants to act when he feels that he's not gambling, when the outcome is closer to a certainty. And I don't think that's where we are. I don't think the Biden administration is terribly strong, but I think Taiwan's support in Congress and among the American people is overwhelming. And I think that would be made very clear. So at this point, I think China is still trying to absorb the lessons that we're all learning about Ukraine, to see how the United States continues to react, and will then base future policy on that. At the same time, I think the United States should take more steps now to show Beijing that we have passed by the period of strategic ambiguity about Taiwan, that we do not interpret the phrase one China to mean what Beijing means, that one China in the Shanghai Communique was never conceded by the United States to mean Taiwan under Beijing's control. And in fact, many basic elements of the Shanghai Communique now no longer apply. And I've said for over 20 years now that the United States should grant full diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, exchange ambassadors and all the rest. And if China doesn't like that, well, that's just too bad, because we're recognizing reality, which is usually a pretty good place to rest your foreign policy. I think it's the right thing for the United States to do. The people of Taiwan have demonstrated they're fully capable of a democratic society with a wide, very robust political debate. They have a free economy, and they've been responsible in their conduct in world affairs. So I think as the United States works to bring South Korea, Japan, Australia, India into closer alignment to deal with the threat from the government in Beijing, that Taiwan is going to have to be a part of this. I mean, I think in Japan today, for example, people understand that a Chinese attack on Taiwan is an attack on Japan. And new president is coming in South Korea. I think this is something that the U.S. needs to discuss with him as well. So it's very complicated. It's a dangerous world in the Indo-Pacific, but it's time now to try and work together with our friends to avoid this problem getting worse. The temptation is always to say, well, look, it's not so bad. We don't want to make it worse. We shouldn't do anything that anybody could take the wrong way. But I think Xi Jinping would read that as a sign of weakness. I think he can be deterred. I think Vladimir Putin could have been deterred from invading Ukraine. And our failure to do that may be read in Beijing as a sign of weakness. I don't think that's where the U.S. is. I think we're going to have a presidential election in 2024. It's a long way away. But where the American people are, I think, is that they still favor the peace through strength policies of Ronald Reagan, even if some of their leaders don't. So that, I think, is we're going to see the political debate in the U.S. on that subject over the next several years. Well, I hope people understand that the failure to deter Vladimir Putin is something that we need to examine to avoid it happening again in other places. It's true that we've put very severe sanctions on Russia, But that shouldn't make us satisfied that, well, it's true that Russia invaded Ukraine, but we're imposing sanctions. We're not happy with that situation. What we wanted, what we failed to do was stop the invasion to begin with. So I hope that one lesson America draws from this with respect to Taiwan is that the structures of deterrence that we have, while they're good as far as they go, need to be strengthened even more. That's one reason to recognize Taiwan as an independent country, to show that the United States understands it's not a lost dependency of China.
You were UN ambassador in Bush administration. What is your evaluation about the function or dysfunction of the UN? Another matter of fact is that China has been quite successful in expanding its influence in the UN and its various organizations. How meaningful is UN in today's world when Russia and China behaves less than responsibly?
Yeah. Well, the UN is a huge organization. That's part of its problem. It tries to do too many things. In the Ukraine crisis, the agencies that are right now performing important work are the humanitarian agencies like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, the World Food Program, the UNICEF, the last two being headed by Americans. That's the traditional role. And they provide, should provide humanitarian assistance on a non-political basis. And so their work is very important. What's broken at the UN are the political decision-making bodies. The Security Council is broken. The General Assembly is broken. The UN Human Rights Council is broken. And Ukraine demonstrates that very clearly. The five major powers, the permanent members of the Security Council, have vetoes that protect them, as in Ukraine's case, Russia, from bearing any responsibility for their conduct. And some would say, well, that's a basic problem with the UN itself. It was a basic problem during the Cold War, which is one reason the UN essentially collapsed. There was a brief period when the Soviet Union dissolved that people thought, well, maybe now it will perform as the framers imagined it would. That has obviously not happened. And so I don't really see any prospect in coming major issues dealing with China or Russia where the UN political bodies will have any significant role at all.